The memory came unbidden, as it always did in the moments before dawn. Lieutenant Marcus Ironfang, 24 years old and already hardened by 3 years of frontier warfare, stood in the blood-soaked command tent at Crimson Keep. The siege had entered its 89th day. Supplies dwindled to nothing. The wounded outnumbered the healthy, and Commander Aldrich lay dying on a camp bed that had seen too many good men breathe their last. The old warrior's hand trembled as he gripped Marcus's wrist. His voice came in wet gasps, each word purchased with agony. "Listen to me, boy. They'll send a parley flag tomorrow. White banner, pretty words, promises of mercy for the civilians trapped inside these walls." The commander coughed, and blood flecked his gray beard. "It's a lie. Same trick they used at Ravensgate. Fed the medics, then slaughtered them when the gates opened." Marcus had wanted to believe differently, wanted to think that even in war, some lines remained uncrossed, that mercy could be answered with mercy, that the faces of starving children glimpsed through arrow slits might move an enemy's heart. He had been young then, young enough to hope. The commander died that night. By dawn, the enemy's white flag appeared as predicted. Marcus, newly burdened with command, made his choice. He ordered the gates opened, ordered food distributed to civilians, ordered his medics to treat wounded on both sides. By noon, 23 medics lay dead in the snow, throats cut while they bandaged the very men who murdered them. The enemy had used the ceasefire to position forces for a breach assault. Only Marcus's rage-blind counterattack, fueled by grief and betrayal, had saved the keep. 3,000 enemy soldiers died that day. Marcus had given no quarter, accepted no surrender, shown no mercy. He knelt afterward in snow, turned red-black with frozen blood, cradling the body of a medic who had sung folk songs to keep spirits high during the darkest weeks of siege. The boy couldn't have been more than 19. His blood had soaked through Marcus's armor, warm at first, then cooling, then cold. The lesson carved itself into Marcus's bones that day, written in the blood of 23 innocents whose compassion had been weaponized against them. 10 years had passed since Crimson Keep. 10 years of victories built on that hard lesson. Marcus Ironfang had become General Marcus Ironfang, then Lord Warden of Frostmark, then simply the Wolf of Frostmark. A man whose tactical brilliance was matched only by his ruthless efficiency. A commander who never lost battles because he understood the true cost of weakness masquerading as virtue. The pre-dawn darkness of his private chamber held the weight of those years. Scars mapped his body like a memoir written in flesh. The puckered burn across his ribs where a vampire lord's claws had come within an inch of his heart. The missing ring finger on his left hand, lost to interrogation torture that he'd endured without breaking. The silver-threaded burns on his right forearm from grappling a werewolf alpha who thought to challenge Frostmark's borders. Each scar carried a lesson. Each wound had purchased wisdom, and all of them together had forged him into the weapon his people needed. Not a man who ruled through love, but through competent protection, through roads kept safe and trade routes secured, through justice that was swift and certain, if harsh. The great hall of Ironhold Citadel echoed with the measured footfalls of power as Marcus ascended to the war room. Morning light filtered through arrow-slit windows, casting blade-sharp shadows across stone floors worn smooth by 3 centuries of boots. Tapestries depicting ancient victories hung from walls thick enough to withstand siege engines. The air smelled of lamp oil, weapon polish, and the perpetual cold that even roaring hearths could never quite banish from stone this old. His war council waited. Commander Cale Stormridge stood at attention, a bear of a man whose gray-streaked beard couldn't hide the fighter's jaw beneath. 30 years of service had earned him the right to speak truth to power, a right he exercised with the careful precision of a surgeon wielding a scalpel. Chancellor Magnus occupied his customary position near the ledgers and supply manifests. Numbers were his battlefield, and he fought there with the same determination other men brought to steel and blood. His ink-stained fingers held more influence than most nobles' swords. The prisoner knelt between 2 guards. Etienne Blackwood, once a trusted vassal, now accused of selling intelligence to enemy territories. The evidence lay spread across the central table: intercepted correspondence, witness testimony, the damning pattern of information leaks that had nearly cost 3 patrols their lives. "My lord," Etienne's voice cracked like river ice in spring, I have served faithfully for 12 years. One mistake surely might be weighed against a decade of loyalty. I have a wife, 3 daughters who depend upon my protection and provision." Marcus studied the man with the detachment that command required. He saw desperation, yes, perhaps even genuine remorse, but he also saw the patrol commander who would never return home, the ranger whose throat had been cut in an ambush made possible by leaked routes, the families who had buried sons and fathers because someone thought silver outweighed honor. Your family's circumstances should have motivated greater loyalty. Marcus's words fell with the weight of finality, not provided justification for betrayal. Those who compromise the safety of many for personal gain forfeit the right to consideration based on personal obligations. The hall seemed to hold its breath. Even the servants standing along the walls froze in their duties, understanding they witnessed the moment where mercy might crack the iron facade, or where justice would be rendered in its purest, coldest form. Etienne Blackwood. Marcus rose from his seat, and the movement carried ritual significance. For the crime of treason against your sworn lord and the people under his protection, I sentence you to death by beheading at dawn tomorrow. Your family's lands are forfeit to the crown. They will be granted safe passage to relatives in the southern territories and sufficient funds to establish themselves, but they may not remain in Frostmark. The guards moved to remove the condemned man. Etienne's protests echoed through the hall, then faded as distance and thick doors muffled his cries. The nobles and officials began filing out, their whispered conversations already spinning the day's events into whatever narrative best served their interests. Marcus remained standing until the last had departed. Then, alone save for Kael, he allowed himself the luxury of one deep breath, the kind that reached down into the places where doubt lived, where questions whispered in voices that sounded uncomfortably like the idealistic lieutenant he had once been. "A harsh sentence," Kael said quietly. His tone carried no judgment, merely observation. The man may have been coerced. His eldest daughter has been ill. Medical expenses could drive a man to desperate choices. Then desperate men should seek aid from their lord before betraying him. Marcus moved to the window overlooking the training yards where soldiers drilled in formations he had designed, each exercise born from lessons written in blood. Better one family suffers than thousands mourn because security was compromised. The words came easily. He had spoken them, or variations thereof, countless times over the years. They formed the bedrock of his philosophy, the foundation upon which Frostmark's peace and prosperity were built. Harsh justice, perhaps, but predictable, reliable. The kind of certainty that let merchants travel roads without fear and farmers plant crops without expecting raiders to burn them before harvest. Yet something in his chest tightened as he spoke. Some small voice that whispered questions he had thought long silenced. The afternoon sun painted the nursery in shades of amber and gold. This room existed outside the cold calculus of command, a space where tapestries showed fairy tales instead of battle victories, where toys scattered across floors polished to mirror brightness. Here, Marcus Ironfang was simply Papa, and that transformation remained the closest thing to magic he still believed in. Liana launched herself into his arms with the fearless enthusiasm unique to 7-year-olds who had never learned to doubt their father's ability to catch them. Her dark hair, so like her mother's, flew wild around a face alight with mischief and intelligence. She wore a practice tunic rather than a proper dress, evidence of the morning's weapons training that Marcus insisted upon despite the tutor's protests. "Papa!" Her voice carried the musical quality that made even hardened soldiers smile. "Master Aldrich says I'm improving with the bow. I hit the center target 3 times today." Marcus settled into the chair beside the window, arranging his daughter comfortably in his lap. Pride warmed him, though he kept his expression appropriately stern. "Center target at what distance?" 30 paces. Liana's enthusiasm dimmed slightly, recognizing the gentle trap. "I know it should be 50, but I'm getting stronger, and Master Aldrich says my form is nearly perfect." Form means nothing if the arrow falls short of its target, but 3 of 3 at 30 paces is commendable progress. Marcus allowed himself a small smile. "Your mother would be proud." The mention of Seraphine brought the familiar ache. 5 years since an assassin's poison had claimed her life. 5 years since she had tasted the wine meant for Marcus, her last act one of protection for the man she loved. Liana had been barely 2 years old, too young to remember her mother's laugh or the way Seraphine had danced through the Citadel's gardens, humming songs in languages Marcus couldn't name. "Tell me about Mama." Liana's request came softly, as it did perhaps once a month, never demanding, but hopeful. Hungry for details of a woman she knew only through stories and the portrait that hung in Marcus's private chambers. "Your mother believed that strength without compassion was merely brutality dressed in armor." Marcus chose his words carefully, walking the line between honoring Seraphine's memory and not undermining the lessons he taught his daughter about survival in a world that punished weakness. She saw possibilities where others saw only problems, could find solutions that satisfied both justice and mercy. Like today? Liana's gray eyes, so much like his own, fixed on him with uncomfortable perception. "With the man you sentenced to death, would Mama have found a different answer?" The question landed with the force of a cavalry charge. Marcus found himself without ready response, caught between the truth of who Seraphine had been and the reality of the world that had killed her. A world where kindness was exploited by those who understood only the language of power. "Your mother lived in gentler times." The words felt like betrayal even as he spoke them. "She had the luxury of idealism because I ensured her safety. Took the hard actions she need not witness. That is the burden of command, little star, to bear the weight of necessary decisions so others may remain innocent." Liana was quiet for a long moment, her small fingers tracing the embroidery on his sleeve. When she spoke again, her voice carried a thoughtfulness that seemed too ancient for 7 years. "But Papa, if we only do cruel things to protect innocence, don't we lose the very thing we're trying to protect?" Marcus had no answer for that. Or rather, he had too many answers, each one contradicting the others. The truth was complicated and uncomfortable, and he suddenly felt very tired. The bells for evening prayers tolled across the citadel. Marcus gently set Liana on her feet, smoothing her wild hair with a hand that had signed death warrants that very morning. "Go find your tutors, little star, and tomorrow we'll work on hitting targets at 50 paces. He watched her skip from the nursery, her energy and innocence like physical forces that left the room dimmer in their absence. Then he stood at the window, looking out over the territory he had spent a decade building into something approaching peace and order. Snow was beginning to fall, early for the season but not unexpected. Winter came harsh to Frostmark, and only the prepared survived it. Somewhere in the back of his mind, in the place where instinct lived, something whispered warning. Change approached on that early snow, carried on winds that cared nothing for carefully constructed philosophies or hard-won wisdom. The storm rolled in with nightfall, transforming the world beyond Ironhold's walls into chaos rendered visible. Wind howled through arrow slits with voices that might have been wolves or might have been the mountain itself crying out against the cold. Snow fell so thick that guards standing watch could barely see the courtyard below, let alone the passes and roads that connected Frostmark to the wider world. Marcus reviewed the evening reports in his study, a chamber lined with maps and military treatises. A fire roared in the hearth, but even its considerable heat seemed barely adequate against the supernatural cold seeping through stones laid down 300 years before. He wore a heavy robe over his tunic, and still his breath misted in the air. Commander Cale entered without preamble, snow dusting his shoulders and concern etched deep in the lines around his eyes. "My lord, we have a situation that requires your attention." Marcus set down the supply manifest he had been reviewing. "Speak plainly, Cale. We're alone, and I'm too tired for formality." 3 groups of travelers were reported in the eastern passes before the storm reached full strength. The relief in Cale's voice at the permission to speak directly was palpable. "None have reached the waypoint stations. We must assume they're trapped somewhere between the high pass and the river crossing." Marcus moved to the map table, studying the terrain with a tactician's eye. The eastern passes were treacherous in good weather, deadly in a storm like this. Multiple ravines and cliff faces, caves that could provide shelter but were difficult to locate in whiteout conditions, and temperatures that would kill an unprepared traveler in less than an hour. Composition of the groups? Cale consulted his notes, though Marcus suspected the man had the details memorized. 2 merchant caravans, likely together by now if they had any sense, and a smaller party, possibly a family. Scouts reported seeing women and children before visibility dropped to nothing. Women and children. The words hung in the cold air between them, Not soldiers who had accepted risk as part of their profession. Not merchants who gambled lives against profit. Innocents who had simply been unlucky in their timing. Marcus ran calculations with the cold precision that had kept him alive through 2 decades of warfare. A rescue expedition in these conditions would require his best rangers, men with families of their own. The storm showed no signs of abating, which meant the rescue party would be operating blind in lethal cold with no guarantee of finding anyone alive, even if they survived the journey themselves. The odds were brutal. Perhaps 10% chance of successfully locating and extracting the stranded travelers, 60% chance of losing men to the storm, either through falls, exposure, or simple disorientation in the whiteout conditions, and that remaining 30% where they found nothing, saved no one, and returned having risked everything for empty snow. Against those odds stood the hard truth that he was responsible for thousands of lives within Frostmark's borders. Every ranger he sent into that storm was a father, a brother, a son. Their deaths would create widows and orphans, would weaken the patrols that kept roads safe, would reduce the trained manpower he would need if the border tensions with Ironwood territory escalated into open conflict. The mathematics were clear. The strategic choice was obvious. Denied. Marcus forced the word out before doubt could take root. We cannot risk trained men in a rescue operation with such low probability of success. The travelers accepted the risks of winter passage when they chose their departure date. That responsibility lies with them, not us. Cale's face remained carefully neutral, but Marcus knew the man well enough to read disappointment in the set of his shoulders. "Very well, my lord. I'll inform the rangers that no action will be taken." The commander turned to leave, and Marcus returned his attention to the supply manifests. Grain stores were adequate, but not abundant. The early winter would strain resources if it lasted. Every decision had to be weighed against the greater good, the larger picture, the cold calculus of keeping the many alive, even when it meant abandoning the few. The lessons of Crimson Keep, carved in blood and bone. The study door crashed open with force that spoke of determination overcoming protocol. Lyanna stood in the doorway, her small frame dwarfed by guards who looked apologetic and helpless in equal measure. Her face was flushed from running, her hair escaping the careful braids her tutors maintained. She wore a nightgown and soft boots, having clearly fled directly from her chambers. "Papa!" Her voice cracked with urgency. "We can see the storm from my windows. It looks angry, like it wants to swallow the whole world." Marcus gestured for the guards to withdraw, then knelt to bring himself to his daughter's eye level. "It is a fierce storm, little star, which is why everyone must remain safely indoors until it passes. The walls are strong, the fire's warm, and we have supplies enough to weather any winter's rage. But what about the people who don't have strong walls?" Lyanna's hands gripped his shoulders with surprising strength. "The ones who are lost out there? The ones who don't have fires?" The question drove straight to the heart of the decision he had just made. Marcus chose his words with care, trying to balance truth with the protection that childhood deserved. Sometimes people make choices that put them at risk. Traveling in winter is dangerous. They knew that when they departed. We cannot save everyone, especially when trying might cost the lives of our own people. But you could try. The simple faith in those words carried more weight than any accusation. "You always try, Papa. You taught me that strong people protect those who can't protect themselves." Marcus felt something shift in his chest, some ancient fault line that he had thought sealed shut, cracking open again. "This is different, little star. This isn't battle or defense. This is nature itself turned hostile. Even our best rangers might die in that storm. And for what? People who may already be dead? Who we might never even find?" Lyanna was quiet for a moment. Then she reached up and touched his face with one small hand, her palm cool against his cheek. "Mama always said that we don't know if we can help until we try, and that not trying is the same as choosing to let people die." The ghost of Seraphine seemed to fill the study. Marcus could almost hear her voice, feel her presence. She had said exactly that, countless times, had argued with him about the hard choices command required, had challenged him to find ways to be both strong and merciful, both protective and compassionate. And he had failed her. Had been reviewing tactical reports when she needed him most, had let her taste the poisoned wine because he was too focused on maps and strategies to notice the assassin moving through his own household. His careful planning, his cold calculations had meant nothing when the person he loved most needed him to simply be present. "Your mother was very wise." Marcus heard his voice break slightly and didn't bother hiding it from his daughter. "She always found ways that I couldn't see, ways that didn't require choosing between mercy and safety." "Can you find a way, Papa? Please?" Liana's eyes shone with tears she was too proud to let fall. Her pup is freezing out there. Some mother is holding her baby and knowing she can't keep him warm enough. I see it when I close my eyes, and it hurts, Papa. It hurts here. She pressed a hand to her chest. Marcus Ironfang, the wolf of Frostmark, the general who had never lost a battle, found himself defeated by a 7-year-old child wielding nothing more than empathy and faith. All his careful logic, his strategic thinking, his hard-won wisdom crumbled before that simple hurt in her voice. Perhaps Crimson Keep had taught him the wrong lesson. Perhaps the medics died not because mercy was weakness, but because he had trusted the wrong people. Given faith to those who deserved none while hardening himself against everyone else. Perhaps true strength lay in being able to distinguish between genuine need and exploitation, rather than simply refusing all compassion as dangerous. "Summon Commander KL." Marcus rose to his feet, decision crystallizing even as doubt screamed warnings in his mind. "And have the stable master prepare thunder and the cold weather mounts. We ride within the hour." Liana's face transformed, fear and sadness replaced by blazing hope. "You're going to save them?" "I'm going to try." The admission felt like stepping off a cliff into darkness, with no certainty of ground below. "And little star, you're coming with me." Her eyes went wide. "But Papa, you always say civilians stay behind walls during operations." "Normally, yes, but you're the reason we're doing this. The reminder that some things matter more than tactics. I won't leave you wondering if we succeeded or failed. You'll see with your own eyes what mercy costs and what it purchases." The ride into the storm felt like descending into some primal chaos older than civilization itself. Marcus led a column of 8 rangers, each man a veteran who had volunteered without hesitation once they learned the mission. Liana rode before him on Thunder, the great destrier that had carried Marcus through a dozen battles. The horse was steady as mountain stone, but even Thunder's confidence wavered in the face of wind that threatened to tear them from the saddle. Visibility extended perhaps 10 feet. Beyond that, the world dissolved into white fury. Snow struck exposed skin like thrown sand, each gust threatening to rip away anything not secured. The cold went beyond discomfort into the realm of physical pain, a pressure that made bones ache and lungs burn with each breath. They moved in tight formation, connected by ropes, so no one could become separated and lost. Each ranger carried chemical heat packs, emergency shelters, medical supplies. Marcus had brought everything his experience suggested might be needed, but he knew full well that preparation could only take you so far. Sometimes nature simply decided to kill you, and all the planning in the world meant nothing. The passes were treacherous even in clear weather. Now, landmarks disappeared under accumulated snow. The trail existed more as memory than visible reality, and Marcus found himself navigating by instinct and dead reckoning. Count of paces between rock formations he could no longer see. Angles of slopes his body remembered, even when his eyes could not confirm them. Liana stayed quiet against his chest, trusting him with the absolute faith that children possessed. He had wrapped her in furs and positioned her inside his own cloak, sharing body heat. She was safer here than left behind, he told himself. If Ironhold fell while he was gone, at least they would face death together. If he died out here, at least she would not spend years wondering what became of him. These were the lies commanders told themselves when making decisions that risked everything on chance. Time lost meaning in the whiteout. They might have been riding for 1 hour or 6. The cold crept deeper, finding its way through even the best furs and leathers. Marcus felt his fingers growing numb inside his gloves, his face losing sensation. Around him the rangers hunched deeper into their protective gear, becoming shapeless bundles that looked barely human. "Papa!" Liana's voice was muffled by layers of cloth. "Look there, something dark." Marcus squinted against the driving snow, following where her small hand pointed. At first he saw nothing but the same white chaos that had surrounded them since departure. Then slowly, a shape emerged. Not the clean lines of a standing structure, but the collapsed chaos of something that had failed under the storm's weight. The lean-to had been well constructed, but no shelter built of branches and canvas could withstand the fury that had descended on these mountains. It lay crumpled like a failed hope, already half buried under drifting snow. But there, barely visible against the white, a dark shape that might have been cloth or leather or frozen flesh. Marcus dismounted, his legs nearly buckling as blood flow resumed to muscles locked in riding position. 2 rangers joined him, weapons drawn not from expectation of enemies, but simple readiness ingrained by years of surviving the unexpected. Together they approached the collapsed shelter. The woman lay curled on her side, arms wrapped around a bundle pressed against her chest. Snow had begun the process of burying her, creating a drift that might have been her grave, or might have been insulation that kept the last warmth from escaping. Her exposed skin showed the bluish tint of advanced hypothermia. Ice crystals formed in her dark hair, but her chest still rose and fell, barely, each breath a shallow thing that might be her last. The bundle she protected proved to be an infant, perhaps 2 or 3 months old. The baby's lips were blue, his tiny face slack in a way that spoke of dangerous cold. But like his mother, he clung to life with stubborn determination that defied all reason. Marcus knelt beside them, pulling off a glove to check the woman's pulse. Her skin felt like ice, but beneath it he found the flutter of a heartbeat. Weak and irregular, but present. The kind of pulse that said death was minutes away, not hours. That any delay would transform rescue into corpse recovery. "Her pup is freezing, Daddy!" Liana's voice came from directly behind him, and he heard her start to cry. "We have to save them right now." The woman's eyes fluttered open at the sound of a child's voice. They were extraordinary eyes, violet like mountain twilight, and they held a desperate clarity that cut through the hypothermia's fog. Her lips moved, forming words without sound. "Please." A breath of air rather than speech. "My son." Then her eyes rolled back and consciousness fled. But she had managed to shift her grip even in that moment, pushing the infant slightly toward Marcus. Her last voluntary act, one of a mother's desperate hope. The tactical part of Marcus's brain assessed the situation with brutal efficiency. The woman was in severe hypothermia, likely suffering from exposure and malnutrition that predated the storm. Survival probability, even with immediate intervention, was perhaps 40%. The infant's chances were marginally better, his smaller body having lost heat more quickly but also being more resilient. But both would require intensive care, resources, warmth. And both would bring complications into his carefully ordered world. Because even in the storm's fury, even with her face half frozen and her body nearly dead, Marcus recognized quality when he saw it. This was no peasant woman caught traveling unwisely. The bone structure of her face spoke of noble bloodlines. The calluses on her hands told of weapons training. And those eyes, in the brief moment they had been open, had held intelligence that suggested education and experience. This woman was dangerous, was running from something or someone, was trouble incarnate wrapped in the disguise of a victim. Every lesson screamed at him to leave her, to take the infant if compassion demanded, but to abandon the complication and threat she represented. Dead, she could not bring enemies to his door. Dead, she could not disrupt the stability he had built. Dead, she would be simply another casualty of winter's cruelty rather than a potential catalyst for chaos. But Liana was watching him with eyes that held the last reflection of Seraphine's spirit. And the woman had used her dying strength not to beg for her own life, but to try to save her child. Had prioritized his survival even as her own ended. That kind of love deserved respect, even from a man who had learned to distrust mercy. "Get them both to the sleds," Marcus's voice carried across the wind to his rangers. "Full medical protocols, chemical warmers, insulation, monitoring. If we can keep them alive for the ride back, Brother Aldrich can handle the rest." The rangers moved with trained efficiency, bundling woman and child in emergency blankets and strapping them to the sleds designed for casualty transport. Marcus watched for a moment, then turned back to Thunder and Liana. His daughter's face was streaked with tears that had frozen on her cheeks, but she was smiling. "Thank you, Papa. Thank you for trying." Marcus lifted her back into the saddle, then mounted behind her. The return journey would be even harder than the approach, with sleds to manage and patients who might die before reaching safety. They still might lose both mother and child despite this effort, might return having risked 8 rangers for corpses. But for the first time in 10 years, since Crimson Keep had taught him its harsh lesson, Marcus Ironfang felt something in his chest that might have been hope, or might have been the first crack in the armor that protected him from caring too much about people he could not save. Either way, the storm that had been simply weather an hour ago had become something more, a test whose results would reshape everything he thought he knew about strength and weakness, protection and cruelty, the price of mercy, and the cost of refusing it. The wolf of Frostmark turned his mount toward home, carrying two strangers who might prove his salvation or his destruction. In the howling darkness, it was impossible to know which fate approached, but he rode toward it anyway, with his daughter's arms around his waist and the first fragile stirrings of something he had thought lost these 10 years. The possibility that mercy, applied with wisdom rather than weakness, might be strength after all. The infirmary at Ironhold Citadel smelled of herbs and desperation. Brother Aldrich moved between his patients with the efficiency of a man who had spent decades learning which wounds could be healed and which required only comfort in their final moments. His hands, gnarled with age but steady with purpose, worked over the woman Marcus had carried from the storm with an intensity that suggested this case held significance beyond simple medical challenge. She hovers at the boundary. The old healer's voice carried the weight of too many pronouncements of death: severe hypothermia, malnutrition dating back months, evidence of healed fractures that suggest systematic abuse. Her body has been pushed beyond what most could endure. That she survived the storm at all speaks to extraordinary will. Marcus stood at the foot of the bed, still wearing the furs that had not quite kept the mountain cold from his bones. 3 hours since they had returned through gates that felt like the threshold between death and life. 3 hours of warming fires and heated blankets, and all the medical knowledge Aldrich had accumulated through long practice. The woman's color had improved from blue-white to merely pale, but consciousness remained elusive. And the child? The infant responds better to treatment. Aldrich gestured to the cradle beside the bed, where the baby lay swaddled in blankets warmed by stones from the hearth. Underweight for his age, perhaps 2 months, but his youth works in his favor. Young bodies recover from cold more readily than adult frames. He will survive, barring complications. Marcus moved to the cradle, studying the small face that had gone from blue to pink in the hours since rescue. The child slept with the absolute trust of innocence, unaware how close death had come, unaware that his mother had spent her last conscious strength trying to push him toward salvation rather than clinging to him in shared oblivion. What kind of woman chose to die alone so her child might have fractionally better odds of survival? What circumstances drove someone to flee into a killing storm rather than seek shelter? These questions circled in Marcus's mind like carrion birds, patient and persistent. Brother Aldrich appeared at his shoulder, voice dropping to confidential tones. "My lord, there are details you should know. The woman bears marks beyond the obvious abuse, scars on her wrists consistent with prolonged restraint, calluses on her fingertips suggesting weapons training, specifically with bladed implements, and these." The healer produced a small leather pouch, found sewn into the lining of her dress. Marcus opened the pouch, tipping its contents onto a nearby table. A ring, sized for a woman's hand, but removed with force, judging by the bent metal. 3 gold coins bearing marks from territories a week's hard ride distant. A folded paper covered in cipher text that might have been merchant codes or might have been intelligence communications. And a small glass vial, empty but retaining traces of liquid that Marcus's experience identified immediately. Poison. Aldrich nodded grimly. Expensive poison. The kind nobles use when they want death to appear natural. The vial is empty because its contents were recently used, I suspect. On whom and under what circumstances, only she can tell us, if she wakes. Marcus studied the collection of evidence that painted a portrait of someone far more complex than a simple victim of circumstance. This woman was educated, trained, dangerous, had been imprisoned and escaped, had killed, if the empty vial told true, was running from something significant enough to risk death by exposure rather than face capture. Post a guard. Marcus returned the items to the pouch. Rotating shifts, 4 at a time. She is not to leave this room without my direct authorization, and no one enters save you and approved medical staff. If she wakes, I am to be informed immediately regardless of hour. You believe she is dangerous. Aldrich's words carried no judgment, merely observation. "I believe she is trouble." Marcus moved toward the door, then paused. "But we have already paid the price of rescuing her. Better to learn what manner of trouble we have welcomed than to waste that cost through careless security." 2 weeks passed in careful dance between trust and caution. Marcus divided his time between regular administrative duties and increasingly frequent visits to the infirmary, where the woman's condition improved with frustrating slowness. Her body healed under Aldrich's care, color returning to skin that revealed fine bone structure and features that spoke of noble bloodlines. But consciousness remained absent, her mind retreating to whatever deep place housed dreams or memories, or perhaps simply exhaustion too profound for easy waking. Liana became a constant presence in the infirmary. The child visited daily, bringing flowers stolen from the greenhouse or drawings made during lessons, or simply her own bright presence. She would sit beside the cradle, entertaining the infant with songs and stories, her 7-year-old imagination spinning tales of brave knights and rescued princesses. Marcus watched his daughter's easy compassion with something between pride and fear. The world had not yet taught Liana that caring created vulnerability, that loving something gave it power to wound you, that opening your heart was the first step toward having it broken. He hoped the world would be gentler with her lessons than it had been with his. By the 3rd week, tensions mounted as intelligence reports confirmed something Marcus had been dreading. Draven Bloodcrown's forces were mobilizing along borders that had remained peaceful for 5 years. Not immediate attack, but the methodical preparation of someone who understood that haste led to mistakes. Someone who could afford patience because he held every advantage save one. Marcus did not yet know what Bloodcrown wanted badly enough to risk open conflict. Commander Kale brought the detailed assessments that painted increasingly dire tactical pictures. 6,000 troops minimum, my lord. Heavy cavalry, siege equipment, and what our scouts believe are tunnel-boring operations disguised as routine engineering work. This is not punitive raid. This is preparation for sustained campaign. Marcus studied the maps with growing certainty that the woman sleeping in his infirmary was somehow connected to these movements. The timing was too precise to be coincidence. She had fled into a killing storm. Days later, one of the most powerful military commanders in the Northern Territories began assembling forces aimed directly at Frostmark. The 4th week brought the messenger Marcus had been expecting but dreading. On the morning that changed everything, the woman finally woke. Marcus had been reviewing intelligence reports in his study when a guard appeared with the message that sent his pulse quickening. "She is awake, my lord. Brother Aldrich requests your immediate presence." The woman sat propped against pillows, her violet eyes fully alert and tracking every movement in the room with the calculation of someone assessing threats and opportunities. She held the infant against her chest with one arm, while the other hand rested beneath the blankets in a position that would allow quick access to a weapon if one were hidden there. Her expression mixed fear and defiance in equal measure, the look of someone who had learned that the world offered few mercies. 4 guards stood at ready positions around the chamber, hands near sword hilts. They had not drawn steel, but the message was clear. Whatever gratitude might be owed for rescue, trust remained a currency not yet earned. Marcus entered slowly, making his movements deliberate and non-threatening. He remained across the room near the door, giving her space to feel less trapped, studying her as she studied him, each taking measure of the other in silence that held the weight of unspoken questions. "Where am I?" Her voice emerged rough from disuse and cold damage, but underneath Marcus heard cultured tones, education and breeding in those syllables, confirmation of noble origin. "Ironhold Citadel, seat of Frostmark territory. You and your son were found 3 days ago, nearly dead from exposure in the mountain passes. My daughter convinced me that rescue was worth attempting despite the storm. You are here as guests under my protection, though that protection comes with certain expectations regarding honesty and cooperation." The woman's eyes flicked to each guard's position, cataloging their readiness and the distances involved. Her hand shifted beneath the blanket, and Marcus knew she had confirmed the absence of any weapon. The slight slump in her shoulders suggested disappointment, but not surprise. She had not expected to wake armed, but had needed to verify her disadvantage. "My son." The words came sharp with maternal anxiety. "Where is he? What have you done with him?" Marcus gestured to the infant in her arms. "You are holding him. He responded well to treatment and has been in your care or Brother Aldrich's attention since arrival. No harm has come to either of you beyond what the storm had already inflicted. Some of the tension eased from her frame. Not complete relaxation, but a fractional lowering of defenses that suggested she wanted to believe him. Her hand emerged from beneath the blanket, moving to cradle her son's head with a gentleness that contrasted sharply with the wariness in her eyes. You are General Marcus Ironfang. Not a question, but statement of fact. The Wolf of Frostmark, victorious commander of Crimson Keep, architect of the Northern Defensive Reforms, slayer of the vampire lord Constantine. Your reputation extends beyond your territory's borders. Marcus felt the shift in dynamic. This was no helpless victim grateful for rescue. This was someone who gathered intelligence, who knew the names and deeds of powerful men, who had been educated to understand the game of politics and power that played out across territories. You have me at disadvantage. I know nothing of you save that you fled into a killing storm rather than face whatever pursues you, that you carry poison in ciphertexts, that you have training with weapons and experience with imprisonment. These facts suggest a story worth hearing, if you choose to share it. The woman was silent for long moments, her eyes moving from Marcus to the guards to the door and back again. Calculating odds, weighing risks, deciding how much truth she could afford to offer and how much she must withhold. The infant stirred against her chest, making small sounds, and she looked down at him with expression that softened every hard line fear had carved in her face. When she spoke again, her voice carried the weight of someone stepping past a point of no return. My name is Cassia Winterborn. My father was Alpha Christoph Winterborn, who ruled Silvercrest territory until his assassination 3 years ago. I am the sole surviving member of House Winterborn, and the man who pursues me is Lord Commander Draven Bloodcrown, who orchestrated my family's murder and has claimed my father's lands through force and fabricated legal authority. The name Winterborn landed like a stone dropped into still water, ripples spreading outward through memory and political calculation. Marcus knew the story, or the official version of it. Silvercrest territory had collapsed into civil war 3 years prior. Alpha Christoph had died in a hunting accident. His territory had been absorbed by neighboring Lord Draven to prevent complete chaos and bloodshed. A tragedy, but one that happened regularly enough in territories governed more by strength than law. But if this woman spoke truth, if Christoph had been assassinated rather than accidentally killed, then the entire political landscape shifted. Territory seized through murder was different from territory claimed through legitimate succession. The Continental Alliance might overlook aggressive expansion, but they could not ignore outright political assassination without undermining the entire system of governance. Before Marcus could respond, Brother Aldrich stepped forward from his position by the hearth. His elderly face transformed into something harder, more focused. The gentle healer Marcus had known for 3 years seemed to shed that identity like a snake discarding old skin. My lord, there is additional information you should know. I am not merely a healer who happened to be present when Lady Cassia needed aid. I am Aldrich Winterborn, her father's youngest brother. I survived the purge by taking monastic vows and have served Ironhold these past 3 years, waiting for this moment. Marcus felt the ground shift beneath, understanding he had thought secure. The gentle healer who had tended Liana's childhood illnesses, who had saved countless lives with patient skill, was also intelligence operative who had hidden in plain sight for years. Every assumption about trust and loyalty suddenly required reevaluation. You claim your father was murdered. Marcus kept his voice carefully neutral, addressing Cassia while his mind raced through implications of Aldrich's revelation. Yet the official reports indicated hunting accident. Tragic, but natural. Why should I believe your version over documented accounts? Because the documents were forged by the man who held the knife. Cassia's voice gained strength, passion burning through the physical weakness. Draven Bloodcrown spent 2 years infiltrating our territory's defenses, corrupting our officers, buying loyalty with promises of power. When he struck, it was not with armies, but with poison and midnight blades. My father, my mother, my 2 brothers, my Uncle Magnus, all dead in a single night. 37 members of House Winterborn slaughtered, while Draven's bought soldiers stood aside and allowed it. And you survived this purge how exactly? My uncle here, Cassia gestured to Aldrich, saw the attack coming hours before it arrived. He faked my death using a servant's body, hid me in the vault beneath our estate's chapel, and gave years of his life to keeping me safe while I rebuilt what Father had created. The intelligence network that Draven thought he had destroyed. Marcus moved closer, close enough to see the truth or lies in her eyes. This woman claimed to be not just noble victim, but trained intelligence operative. Someone who had spent years gathering information, building networks, operating in shadows. If she spoke true, she was potentially the most valuable asset he could imagine. If she lied, she was the most dangerous threat. The infant you hold, his parentage? Pain flashed across Cassia's face, raw and immediate. Lord Philip Thornhart of the Southern Territories, a man who believed in justice enough to help me gather evidence of Draven's crimes, a man I loved, who loved me in return, who died because Draven's agents discovered our relationship. They captured Philip, tortured him for information about my location, then executed him as traitor to the Alliance. I learned of his death 3 weeks after discovering I carried his child. The emotional honesty in those words felt genuine. Marcus had heard enough lies over the years to recognize truth when spoken, and this woman's grief carried the weight of authentic loss. You were married when you carried this child. To Lord Victor of the Minor Houses, yes. A cover identity, a man of little consequence who provided respectability and access to certain circles. Victor was Draven's agent, assigned to watch me without knowing my true identity. When he discovered I carried another man's child, when he learned who I truly was, he planned to kill both myself and the infant to earn reward from Draven. I poisoned his wine before he could act. Self-defense under any reasonable law, but Draven has named it murder and issued demands for my extradition. There it was. The empty poison vial explained. Marcus found himself believing her, which was perhaps foolish but felt true nonetheless. This woman had killed her husband in self-defense, had fled with her infant son into winter's fury rather than face the man who had butchered her family. Was running still, would always be running unless someone with sufficient power chose to stand between her and her pursuer. 3,000 Ironwood troops massing at the border. The tactical reality crashed down like an avalanche. 2-to-1 numerical disadvantage. Supply lines vulnerable at river crossing. No clear path to victory in conventional engagement. And at the center of it all, one woman and her child, the catalyst for a war that could destroy everything Marcus had built. You understand the position this places me in. Marcus chose honesty over diplomacy, housing you as harboring a fugitive from justice, assuming Draven's version of events holds legal weight. Protecting you is potential declaration of hostility against territories with combined military strength exceeding my own forces. Cassia met his gaze without flinching. I understand, and I would not ask shelter if alternatives existed. But Draven will kill my son to eliminate the last Winterborn bloodline, will kill me after using my existence to legitimize his territorial claims. If you send me away, you send us both to certain death. I can only hope that the man who risked his soldiers in a killing storm to save strangers possesses mercy enough to grant temporary sanctuary, while I make arrangements for permanent refuge elsewhere. The infant chose that moment to wake fully, his small face scrunching in preparation for cries that would demand attention. Cassia adjusted her hold, producing a feeding bottle that Aldrich must have provided, offering it with practiced maternal efficiency. The baby quieted immediately, feeding with single-minded focus. Marcus watched mother and child for a long moment, seeing in them something that resonated with memories of Seraphine and infant Leanna, remembering the fierce protectiveness that fatherhood had awakened in him, the willingness to burn the world to keep his daughter safe. You may remain as my guest until such time as safe arrangements can be made for your departure. The words emerged before full consideration of their implications. But Marcus felt their rightness, even as his tactical mind catalogued the problems they would create. You will be housed in the West Tower, under guard for your own protection and the security of my household. Brother Aldrich will continue treating both you and your son, and you will provide me with detailed intelligence regarding Draven Bloodcrown's operations, resources, and vulnerabilities. Cassia's relief was visible, shoulders dropping from combat readiness towards something approaching ease. Thank you, General. You will not regret this mercy. Marcus almost laughed at that. He already regretted it, in the sense that he saw clearly the challenges it would create. But regret and rightness were not opposites. Sometimes the correct choice was also the difficult one, and a man's character was measured by his willingness to choose right over easy. Do not thank me yet. The complications this will bring have not yet arrived. When they do, you may find my mercy comes with sharp edges and difficult demands. The nights that followed transformed Marcus's war room into shared domain. Cassia would arrive after Felix slept, carrying documents she had somehow secreted even during her near-death flight. Marcus would have maps prepared, intelligence summaries organized, questions listed with military precision. They worked with the efficiency of soldiers who had learned to trust each other's competence. She would identify vulnerabilities in Draven's supply lines, tracing routes on maps with fingers that had memorized terrain through years of study. He would calculate force requirements for exploitation, running scenarios that balanced risk against potential gain. She would explain the personalities of enemy commanders, the feuds and alliances that shaped loyalties. He would design tactics that leveraged those weaknesses, finding angles of attack that conventional wisdom would miss. 1 week became 2. Intelligence flowed like water finding its level. Cassia possessed encyclopedic knowledge of Draven's operations, the kind of detailed understanding that came from years of patient intelligence gathering. She knew which officers were loyal through conviction versus those bought with coin, knew supply depot locations and guard rotations, knew the politics that bound Draven's alliance together and the pressure points that might fracture it. And gradually, almost without Marcus noticing the transition, respect became something warmer. Admiration for her strategic mind mixed with awareness of how lamplight caught in her dark hair when she leaned over documents. Professional partnership layered over the undeniable pull that neither acknowledged but both felt. He caught himself watching her hands as she traced troop movements, noting the precision of her gestures. Found his attention drifting from tactical discussions to the curve of her neck when she turned to study a different map. Recognized the danger in such distractions, but could not quite force himself to maintain pure professional distance. Cassia seemed to sense his awareness, meeting his eyes across the table with understanding that needed no words. Her expression held gratitude and regret in equal measure. The acknowledgement that what might grow between them was a flower attempting to bloom in poisoned soil. Beautiful, perhaps, but unlikely to survive circumstances that left no room for personal feelings. Better to focus on the battle at hand than dream of futures that approaching conflict made increasingly unlikely. The messenger arrived on the morning of the 28th day, riding a horse that had been pushed beyond reasonable limits and bearing colors that Marcus recognized with sinking certainty. Black and crimson, the heraldry of House Bloodcrown. Draven's reach extending into Frostmark territory with the confidence of someone who expected his demands would be met without significant resistance. Commander Kale brought the messenger directly to Marcus's study, the man's appearance speaking clearly of hard travel. Mud-splattered cloak, exhaustion in every line of his frame, but eyes sharp with the awareness of someone carrying messages too important for delay. General Marcus Ironfang. The messenger's voice carried formal weight. I bring communication from Lord Commander Draven Bloodcrown regarding matters of justice and territorial sovereignty. He requests immediate audience or written response regarding the fugitive Cassia Winterborn, believed to be harbored within your walls. Marcus accepted the sealed letter, breaking the wax and scanning contents that matched his expectations. Formal language wrapped around iron demands. Extradition of the fugitive. Surrender of evidence and testimony. Assurances that Frostmark territory would not harbor criminals sought by legitimate authority. Thinly veiled threats about consequences for those who interfered with pursuit of justice. You may inform Lord Commander Bloodcrown that his communication has been received and its contents are under consideration. Marcus kept his voice carefully neutral. Frostmark territory maintains its own standards of justice and does not automatically honor extradition requests without thorough review of evidence and circumstances. A formal response will be provided within the customary timeframe. The messenger's expression suggested this was not the immediate acquiescence he had expected. My lord, I am instructed to emphasize the urgency of this matter. Lord Commander Bloodcrown has mobilized significant resources in pursuit of the fugitive. Delay in her surrender will be interpreted as hostile act requiring appropriate response. Your instructions are noted and will be factored into my deliberations. Marcus gestured to Kael. See that the messenger is provided food, rest, and fresh mount for his return journey. He departs at dawn." After the messenger left, Kael closed the study door and turned with expression that mixed respect and concern. "My lord, you understand what refusal will mean. Draven commands 6 allied territories, can field armies that dwarf our forces. This is not an enemy we can defeat through conventional warfare." "I understand the mathematics, Kael." Marcus moved to the window overlooking training yards where soldiers drilled in formations he had designed, "but I also understand that some decisions cannot be made based purely on military calculation." The council chamber filled with the weight of impending crisis as Marcus's key advisors assembled around the great table. Commander Kael represented military concerns. Chancellor Magnus brought economic and political expertise, and Cassia Winterborn stood at the far end under guard, her recovered strength evident in straight spine and level gaze. Marcus presented Draven's demands without editorial comment, allowing the council to absorb the full scope of pressure being applied. Then he gestured to Cassia. "Lady Winterborn, you stand accused of murder and theft. Lord Commander Bloodcrown claims legal authority to demand your extradition. Before this council makes recommendation regarding response, you will have opportunity to present your defense." Cassia stepped forward with confidence that surprised Marcus. "Honored council members, I thank you for this audience." She addressed the room with clear voice. "Lord Commander Draven Bloodcrown accuses me of crimes I will not deny committing. I killed my husband, Lord Victor. I did steal documents and resources when I fled. These facts are not in dispute. What is disputed is whether these acts were crimes or legitimate self-defense." She produced papers that Aldrich must have preserved, documents bearing official seals and correspondence that Marcus's advisors examined with increasing concern. Birth records, marriage contracts, witness statements describing the night Silvercrest burned. Physical evidence of her claims spread across the table like accusations. Chancellor Magnus leaned forward, studying the documents with scholars' attention. "These are serious accusations, Lady Winterborn, but Lord Commander Bloodcrown enjoys alliance recognition and legal standing. Your documents, even if authentic, represent claims by interested party rather than impartial evidence. Then investigate independently." Cassia's voice carried controlled passion. "Send agents to Silvercrest territory, interview survivors, examine financial records. You will find that Draven's rise was built on murder, and that his pursuit of me is not about justice, but about eliminating the last witness to his crimes." The debate that followed revealed the fundamental tension between principle and pragmatism that would define Marcus's choice. Magnus argued economics. Kael presented military disadvantages. But beneath the tactical discussions lay a simpler question. Would Frostmark be the kind of territory that surrendered innocence to appease threats? The vote, when it came, was split but ultimately in Marcus's favor. He cast the deciding vote, and Frostmark's position became official policy. Cassia Winterborn would remain under his protection. Draven's extradition demands would be formally refused, and whatever consequences followed would be met with resolve born not from confidence in victory, but from certainty that some principles were worth defending regardless of cost. After the council dispersed, Marcus found Cassia waiting outside his study. She looked smaller somehow, despite the strength she had shown before the council. Vulnerable in ways that public performance had hidden. "Thank you." The words emerged simple and heartfelt. "I know what this costs you. Do not mistake my decision for pure altruism." Marcus maintained professional distance. "You possess intelligence regarding Draven's operations. That information has strategic value, yet you made your decision before knowing what information I could provide." Cassia moved closer. "You chose to protect us because it was right, not because it was profitable." They stood in silence for a moment, the space between them charged with unspoken possibilities. Marcus felt the pull of attraction, the way her presence shifted something in his careful equilibrium. But there were too many complications already. "You should rest." The formal tone returned. "Regain your strength. When Draven's response arrives, and it will arrive soon, I will need every advantage you can provide." Cassia nodded, accepting the dismissal with grace. As she turned to leave, she paused. "General Ironfang? Your daughter, Liana. She has visited Felix and me every day. She is remarkable, a credit to her mother's memory and your teaching." Then she was gone, leaving Marcus alone with thoughts that refused to quiet. He had chosen a path that led toward conflict and uncertainty. had bet his territory's security on the truth of a stranger's story and the righteousness of principles that cold experience had taught him to distrust. Outside his window, the first winter stars appeared in darkening sky. Somewhere beyond the horizon, Draven Bloodcrown was receiving news of refusal and calculating response. Marcus settled at his desk to begin drafting defensive strategies and contingency plans, work that would occupy him through the night, work that might prove futile if Draven's resources truly dwarfed Frostmark's capacity to resist. But better to face the storm standing than to kneel before it in hopes of mercy that would never come. Some things were worth fighting for, even when the odds suggested fighting was suicide. Some lines, once drawn, could not be uncrossed without losing everything that made the crossing worthwhile. The night deepened, the stars wheeled overhead, and in the distance, too far yet to hear but approaching with terrible certainty, came the thunder of forces gathering for war. The siege began not with dramatic assault, but with the patient methodology of professional warfare. Marcus stood on the battlements of Ironhold Citadel, watching enemy forces establish their positions with the efficiency that marked Draven Bloodcrown's reputation for tactical competence. 6,000 soldiers, perhaps more, arranged in formations that spoke of careful planning and adequate supply lines. This was not a hasty, punitive expedition, but a calculated campaign designed for sustained operations. Commander Cale appeared at his shoulder, the older man's face showing the strain of 4 weeks spent preparing defenses against an enemy whose arrival had been inevitable from the moment Marcus refused extradition demands. They have positioned siege equipment beyond our artillery range, trebuchets, battering rams, and what appears to be tunnel-boring equipment. This will not be a quick assault. No. Marcus studied the enemy positions with the cold assessment that had kept him alive through 2 decades of warfare. Draven knows our walls are too strong for immediate breach. He plans to starve us out while his engineers undermine our foundations. A strategy that works if we allow it time to mature. The food stores? 3 months at full rationing, perhaps 4 if we reduce civilian portions to subsistence levels. Cale's voice carried the weight of calculations that involved children going hungry, while soldiers maintained fighting strength. Water is adequate from the underground springs. Morale is the greater concern. The people understand we face siege because we harbor a fugitive. Not all agree the choice was wise. Marcus turned from contemplating enemy positions to face his second-in-command directly. Do you agree the choice was wise? Cale was quiet for a long moment, gray eyes studying the stones beneath their boots. Then he met Marcus's gaze with the honesty that 3 decades of service had earned him. No, my lord. I think we have wagered everything on principle when pragmatism might have preserved what we have built. But I also know that sometimes the right choice and the wise choice are not the same. And I have lived long enough to understand that men must be able to face themselves in mirrors. That is why I value your counsel, old friend, even when it reminds me how much this gamble costs. The days that followed settled into the grinding routine of siege warfare. Draven's forces maintained steady pressure without committing to costly assaults. Trebuchets launched stones at irregular intervals, more to deny sleep than inflict damage. Arrows fell like deadly rain whenever defenders showed themselves on the walls. And deep beneath the surface, mining operations proceeded with patient persistence toward foundations that had stood for 3 centuries. Marcus divided his time between defensive coordination and working with Cassia to understand Draven's likely strategies. She proved invaluable, her years of intelligence work providing insights into how Bloodcrown forces operated, which officers could be trusted, which might be bribed or turned, where supply lines ran vulnerable, what tactics Draven favored when conventional approaches stalled. They spent long hours in the war room, bent over maps and reports, their partnership developing the easy efficiency of soldiers who had learned to trust each other's competence. Marcus found himself respecting her strategic mind, the way she could analyze complex situations and identify leverage points others missed. Found himself watching the way lamplight caught in her dark hair when she leaned over documents, the precise movements of hands that had been trained to kill but now cradled an infant with infinite gentleness. He was falling for her, he realized. Not the sudden madness of youth, but the slower recognition of partnership that might become something more. Recognition complicated by circumstances that left no room for personal feelings. by the siege pressing against their walls and the responsibility he bore for thousands of lives wagered on his choice to protect her. Cassia seemed to sense his awareness, meeting his eyes across the table with understanding that needed no words. Her expression held gratitude and regret in equal measure. The acknowledgement that what might grow between them was a flower attempting to bloom in poisoned soil. Beautiful, perhaps, but unlikely to survive. Better to focus on the battle at hand than dream of futures that siege made increasingly unlikely. The breakthrough came in week 5, when exhaustion and hunger had begun to erode the careful discipline Marcus's forces maintained. A runner arrived in the war room where Marcus reviewed the latest reports on food stores that had somehow dwindled faster than rationing should allow. "Brother Aldrich requests your immediate presence, my lord. He says there is matter requiring urgent attention." Marcus found the old healer in his workroom, gray face grave with the expression of someone bearing news that would reshape everything. "We have traitor in our ranks, my lord. Someone has been contaminating grain stores with compounds that accelerate spoilage while appearing normal to casual inspection. Our food shortage is not natural, but sabotage." The revelation landed like a blade between the ribs. Marcus's hands trembled as he gripped the edge of Aldrich's work table, knuckles going white with the pressure of containing rage that threatened to explode into violence. "How long has this been occurring?" "Based on rate of contamination, I estimate 3 weeks. Perhaps longer if the saboteur was cautious in early stages." Aldrich gestured to samples spread across his work table. "The poison is subtle, requiring careful examination to detect. Whoever did this possesses both chemical knowledge and regular access to our storage facilities. Summon the household council." Marcus forced the words through clenched teeth. "Every person with vault access will account for their movements and submit to questioning. We will identify this traitor before nightfall." The interrogations proceeded with grim efficiency through the afternoon. Marcus conducted them personally, his scarred hands sorting through ledgers, while his gray eyes studied each face for the subtle wrongness that years of command had taught him to recognize. Most subjects demonstrated clear innocence, their shock and anger at betrayal genuine enough to read without difficulty. But one man's responses carried the subtle wrongness that Marcus's instincts recognized: Lord Garrett Ashwood, vassal who controlled significant holdings along Frostmark's southern border, a man whose family had served 3 generations, whose daughter played with Lyanna in the Citadel Gardens, who had voted against sheltering Cassia in the initial council session, and whose subsequent cooperation had seemed like loyalty overcoming initial disagreement. The evidence, when Marcus pressed, tumbled out with the relief of secrets too heavy to carry longer. Garrett confessed to the sabotage, to communication with Draven's forces, to coordination that had allowed enemy intelligence about defensive positions and patrol rotations. "My daughter is 4 years old, General." Garrett's voice cracked with defensive justification as tears carved channels through the grime on his face. 4 years old, and yesterday I held her while she sobbed because her belly hurt too much for sleep. My wife, you should see my wife. Skin hanging on bones like parchment stretched over kindling, hair falling out in clumps when she tries to brush it. She was beautiful once, my lord, strong enough to work the fields alongside our people. Now she looks like the plague corpses we burned after the fever took the eastern villages. I watched good men, my men, die because they were too weak to hold shields when the enemy probed our defenses, too malnourished to run when tactical retreat was necessary. And for what? For a woman none of us knew 3 weeks ago. For your principles that fill no bellies and warm no children through nights when winter presses against thin walls. Draven offered food, my lord, offered to end this madness. All he wanted was one person, one, against the hundreds starving inside these walls. Tell me, General, where is the justice in that mathematics? Where is the wisdom in choosing a stranger's life over your own people's survival? Marcus heard raw truth in those words and hated how they resonated with his own doubts. This was Crimson Keep's question returning like a ghost that would not rest. Whether protecting one meant sacrificing many, whether mercy was merely selective cruelty wearing virtue's mask to hide its face from honest mirrors. But there was difference between mercy shown to those who deserved it and surrender to evil's demands. Garrett had not sought alternative solutions, had not come to his lord for aid when desperation gnawed at his conscience. He had taken silver coins to betray everyone who trusted him, had poisoned food that might have sustained children whose only crime was being born in difficult times. That crossed lines that desperation could explain but never excuse. "You have killed men with your sabotage." Marcus kept his voice level, though rage burned beneath the surface like banked coals waiting for wind to transform them into inferno. Guards who grew too weak to hold their posts during night watches. Civilians whose bodies could not fight infection because malnutrition had destroyed the strength their immune systems required. You have murdered your own people to serve the enemy who besieges us. "I have tried to save them!" Garrett's composure cracked completely, revealing the desperate father beneath the traitor's disguise. "Your pride, your principles, your need to feel righteous while children starve, these things will kill everyone in this citadel. I tried to force your hand toward the only rational choice remaining. The law was clear. Treason demanded execution. Garrett had earned death through betrayal that had cost lives and would cost more before siege ended. Marcus had sentenced men for lesser crimes, had stood unmoved while heads fell to the executioner's blade and blood soaked into wood worn smooth by previous victims. Justice required consistency, demanded that personal feelings not corrupt the application of law that held society together when chaos pressed against every border. But Garrett's daughter was 4 years old, would watch her father die and grow up carrying that weight like stones in a sack she could never set down, would learn that principle mattered more than mercy, that righteousness was purchased with the blood of those who chose desperate measures in desperate times when no other options seemed to exist. Marcus thought of Crimson Keep, where showing mercy to the wrong people had gotten 23 medics slaughtered while they bound wounds of men who murdered them. Thought of the years since, where hardness had kept his territory safe, even as it had cost him pieces of his humanity, one decision at a time, until he barely recognized the idealistic lieutenant who had once believed in third options. Thought of Liana asking whether doing only cruel things to protect innocence destroyed the very innocence being protected. Exile. The word emerged before full consideration of its implications, but Marcus felt its rightness even as part of him screamed that this was weakness that would be exploited. You and your family have until dawn to leave Frostmark territory. You will be escorted to the southern border and released with sufficient supplies to reach your cousins in the lowlands. Your lands are forfeit to the crown. Your name will be struck from the rolls of service. But your daughter will not watch her father's execution. Garrett stared with expression mixing shock and something that might have been gratitude fighting with shame for dominance of his features. "My lord, I do not deserve this mercy." "No, you do not." Marcus felt exhaustion settling into his bones like winter cold seeping through inadequate walls. "But your daughter deserves to know her father, even a father who betrayed his oath. And I will not become Draven Bloodcrown by forgetting that mercy has value even when applied to those who have earned none of it." The decision cost Marcus dearly in the hours that followed. 40% of his noble families departed with Garrett at dawn, their loyalty apparently conditional on leadership that never showed weakness or doubt. 300 soldiers requested release from service, unwilling to continue fighting for commander who would spare traitors. The siege that had been merely difficult became potentially catastrophic as fighting strength reduced and morale crumbled like walls undermined by patient engineering. Commander Cale found Marcus alone on the battlements well after midnight, staring at stars that offered no guidance for impossible situations. His breath misted in the freezing air, armor crackling with ice that formed in the joints despite the furs wrapped around his shoulders. "You showed mercy to a man who tried to kill us through starvation. Half the Citadel thinks you have grown soft. The other half wonders if you have lost your mind entirely." "Perhaps both assessments are correct." Marcus did not turn from his contemplation of the night sky. "Perhaps I have indeed lost whatever hardness kept me effective. Perhaps mercy is weakness that will cost everyone who depends upon my protection." Cale was quiet for a long moment before speaking, his weathered face catching starlight in the deep lines that decades of command had carved. "At Crimson Keep, you learned that mercy to enemies gets your people killed. Today you showed mercy to a traitor who endangered your people. These seem like opposite lessons, my lord. How do you reconcile them?" Marcus finally turns to face his old friend and found no judgment in the weathered features, only genuine curiosity seeking understanding. "I think perhaps Crimson Keep taught me too absolute a lesson. that I learned to see all mercy as dangerous because I once showed it to those who deserved none. Garrett betrayed us, yes, but from desperation, not malice, from love of family, not hatred of principles. The response to his crime need not be identical to the response I should have given those who murdered medics under flag of truce. KL nodded slowly, absorbing the distinction. So mercy becomes a calculation like any other tactical decision, applied where it serves larger purposes, withheld where it enables harm. Or perhaps mercy should not be tactical at all. Perhaps it should be the default, with harshness reserved for those who demonstrate they will use compassion as weapon against the compassionate. That is a dangerous philosophy for commander in time of war. Yes. Marcus returned his gaze to the stars, but no more dangerous than the philosophy that turns commanders into the very thing they fight against. I would rather risk too much mercy than guarantee too much cruelty. The dawn brought news that transformed tactical calculations and personal philosophy into suddenly irrelevant concerns. A rider approached under flag of truce, bearing message that made Marcus's blood run cold despite the steel he had forged around his heart over years of hard service. The words burned themselves into his vision as he read the formal script. We hold the position where Lady Cassia Winterborn was attempting to flee with her child. Our forces intercepted them at the Eastern Pass during the confusion following Lord Garrett's departure. Both are now our guests. Your presence is required to discuss their disposition. Every sacrifice, every hard choice, every principle defended now rendered meaningless by her capture. Cassia had fled, had taken Felix and attempted escape during the chaos of Garrett's exodus, and had been captured by forces that had apparently been waiting for exactly such opportunity. Unless Marcus studied the message again, noting details that others might miss. The phrasing was too precise, the timing too convenient, and Cassia was far too intelligent to simply run blind into terrain where enemy patrols would be positioned. She had not fled in panic. She had executed a plan. The question was whether that plan included getting captured, or whether something had gone wrong that he now needed to fix through desperate action. Marcus rode to the Parley location with Commander KL and 6 guards, knowing he was likely riding into trap, but unable to refuse when Cassia and Felix's lives hung in balance. The neutral ground was a clearing 200 yards from Ironhold's walls, visible from the battlements but beyond bowshot. Draven waited with his own guard contingent and 2 prisoners who made Marcus's chest constrict with emotions he could not afford to show. Cassia stood with chains on her wrists, purple bruise darkening her cheek where someone had struck her hard enough to split the skin. But her spine remained straight, and her violet eyes held defiance that said whatever they had done to her had not broken anything important. Felix was not visible, and Marcus felt sick dread at the implications of the child's absence. "General Marcus Ironfang." Draven Bloodcrown's voice carried cultured tones that suggested education and sophistication. "Finally, we meet in person rather than through intermediaries and formal communications. I trust you appreciate the trouble I have taken to arrange this conversation." Draven was not the monster Marcus had expected. No twisted features or obvious cruelty in his bearing. Instead, he appeared professional, competent, a man who might have been respected commander in different circumstances, which somehow made him more frightening than simple villainy would have been. True evil rarely announced itself with obvious markers. "You have my attention." Marcus kept his voice level. "State your terms. Unconditional surrender of Ironhold Citadel. Public execution of yourself as example to others who might consider harboring fugitives from justice. Annexation of Frostmark territory under Bloodcrown authority." Draven smiled without humor reaching his cold eyes. "In exchange, I offer quick death rather than the prolonged suffering your people will endure if siege continues. I offer mercy to civilians who bear no responsibility for your poor judgment. And I offer to spare the child currently held in comfortable circumstances within my camp." Marcus felt cold calculation warring with hot rage that threatened to overwhelm the discipline years of command had instilled. Draven was offering to murder him and steal his territory in exchange for not torturing everyone he had sworn to protect. This was negotiation only in the sense that threat of greater harm was being used to make terrible terms appear reasonable by comparison. "The woman?" Marcus gestured to Cassia. "Will face trial for her crimes, followed by appropriate punishment." Draven's tone suggested that trial and punishment had already been determined. She murdered her lawful husband and stole property belonging to territories under my protection. Justice demands accounting. Justice. Marcus nearly laughed at the word coming from the man who had orchestrated the slaughter of an entire noble house to seize their territory. Your concern for justice is touching, Lord Commander. Tell me, how does justice account for the assassination of Alpha Christoph Winterborn and the murder of his family? Draven's expression did not change. Alpha Christoph died in hunting accident, as official records clearly document. That his territory required stabilizing intervention following the unfortunate chaos of his death does not constitute crime. You have been listening to a madwoman's fantasies, General. A woman who killed her husband and now seeks to justify her crime through elaborate conspiracy theories. Marcus looked to Cassia, saw in her eyes the same defiance he had observed when she first woke in his infirmary. She believed her truth absolutely, and nothing Draven said could shake that certainty. But belief and proof were different things. Marcus had staked everything on her version of events, had brought siege and suffering to his people based on faith in a stranger's story. What guarantee do I have that if I surrender you will honor any of these terms? My reputation. Draven's answer came without hesitation. I am many things, General, but I am not needlessly cruel. I have no desire to rule over smoking ruins and embittered populations. You surrender and die cleanly. Your people live and prosper under new administration. Stability returns. That is my offer. You have until sunset to accept. And if I refuse? Then siege continues until starvation or disease or simple despair opens your gates. Then I show no mercy to anyone. Then your people suffer because you chose pride over pragmatism. Draven gestured to Cassia with casual dismissal. This woman is not worth the cost you are paying. Accept that truth before it destroys everything you have built. The parley ended with Marcus returning to Ironhold no closer to solution than when he departed. Draven's terms were unacceptable, but refusing them meant condemning his people to continued suffering with no clear path to victory. Cassia's capture had eliminated the moral clarity that had justified his choices. Protecting her had meant something when she remained under his care. Continuing to resist when she was already lost meant dying for principle rather than person. He found Liana waiting in his study, her young face showing worry beyond her years. She had heard about Cassia's capture, had understood that everything was falling apart. "Papa, what are you going to do?" Marcus gathered his daughter close, holding her small frame against his chest and feeling her heartbeat steady where his own thundered with stress and fear. "I do not know, little star. All my choices seem to lead to disaster. I can surrender and die, saving you and the people at cost of my life and honor. Or I can continue fighting for principles that may mean everyone dies, including you. What would Mama do?" Marcus thought of Seraphine, who had died because she tasted wine meant for him, who had seen danger approaching and stepped between it and the man she loved without hesitation or second thought. "Your mother would tell me that sometimes the right choice is not the one that saves the most people. Sometimes it is simply the one you can live with, or die with." "Then you already know what you will do." Liana pulled back enough to look him in the eyes with wisdom that seemed impossible for 8 years. "You will not surrender because that is not who you are. You will find another way, even if it seems impossible, because that is what heroes do. They find ways when everyone else sees only endings." From the mouth of a child came the faith that circumstances had nearly extinguished in Marcus's heart. He wanted to protect his daughter from the hard truth that real life did not follow story logic, that heroes often failed, and principles sometimes led to catastrophe. But looking at her face, seeing Seraphine's spirit looking back at him, Marcus found he could not quite abandon hope entirely. If we are to find a way, we will need help from unexpected quarters. He set Liana down and moved to his desk, pulling out paper and beginning to write with swift precision. There are forces beyond this siege that may yet shift the balance, but activating them requires risk and sacrifice that may make everything worse before it improves. The letter he crafted was addressed to Brother Aldrich, but its contents were meant for different audience entirely. Marcus had spent weeks working with Cassia, learning not just about Draven, but about the intelligence network she claimed her father had built. Learning about displaced loyalists and resistance cells that had survived the purge of House Winterborn, learning about resources that existed if someone had courage to activate them. Cassia had shown him how to make contact, had provided codes and procedures for reaching agents she insisted still operated throughout territories now controlled by Draven. Marcus had thought the information might prove useful eventually, had not imagined he would need to deploy it so desperately or so soon. The response came within 2 days, delivered by a messenger who looked like simple trader, but whose eyes held the alertness of trained operative. Marcus met him in secure room with only Kael present, and heard words that transformed despair into something that might have been hope. Lady Winterborn's network remains operational, General, more extensive than you perhaps realize. We have 1,500 fighters ready to mobilize across 6 territories. We have placed agents within Draven's own forces, men who serve him only because alternatives appeared non-existent. And we have evidence of his crimes sufficient to turn Continental Alliance opinion if properly presented. Marcus felt pieces of a larger picture suddenly snapping into focus. Cassia had not simply been running when she fled into that storm, had been executing a plan, moving toward Ironhold specifically because intelligence had identified him as potential ally. Her capture had not been failure, but calculated risk, perhaps even intentional sacrifice to position herself where she could coordinate from within enemy ranks. The woman was more dangerous than he had imagined, more capable. And if her network truly possessed the resources claimed, then perhaps this siege was not ending Marcus had assumed inevitable. "What do you need from me?" The question emerged with renewed energy born from possibility replacing resignation. "Hold for 5 more days." The messenger's answer was simple, but the implications staggering. "We are coordinating simultaneous uprisings across all territories where Draven has imposed control. When we strike, his forces here will have to withdraw to defend against multiple threats. But if Ironhold falls before we are ready, the entire operation collapses." 5 days. Marcus looked to Kael, saw the same grim calculation on the weathered face. "We have perhaps 3 days of food remaining even at starvation rations. Can barely maintain wall defenses with the soldiers who remain. 5 days is impossible. Then you will need to make impossible become possible." The messenger produced sealed letter bearing Cassia's handwriting. "Lady Winterborn asked that I deliver this if I reached you. She said you would understand her meaning." Marcus opened the letter and read words that cut through pragmatism, to reach the part of him that had chosen to ride into Killingstorm because his daughter's compassion demanded it. "My beloved General, by the time you read this, I will be exactly where I need to be. Do not mourn my capture or consider rescue. I am not victim but weapon, and I have placed myself in position to strike from where enemies will not expect. Trust the network. Trust yourself. And teach Felix that his mother loved him enough to become Monster's prisoner so he and others like him might live free." Below her signature was detailed breakdown of intelligence she had gathered, codes for communicating with agents, tactical weaknesses in Draven's siege positions. The next 3 days were the longest of Marcus's life. Food supplies dwindled to nothing. Children cried from hunger that could not be assuaged with pretty words or noble principles. Soldiers grew weak, their ability to maintain defenses compromised by bodies that had no fuel to burn. Disease began spreading through the weakened population, and Brother Aldrich worked himself to collapse trying to treat infections that healthy immune systems would have shrugged off easily. Marcus divided his time between the walls and the infirmary, between tactical planning and simple presence with his suffering people. He could offer no solutions, no timeline for relief, only his willingness to share their suffering and his faith that endurance mattered even when hope seemed foolish. Liana worked beside him, her small hands helping to tend the sick, her voice singing songs to children too weak to play. His daughter had become the heart of resistance, the visible reminder of innocence that deserved protection. People looked at her and remembered why they endured, looked at her and found strength they thought exhausted. On the 4th day, when Marcus thought they could not possibly last another night, the uprising began. It started with fires visible on the horizon as resistance cells struck supply depots throughout Draven's extended positions. Then came the news that territories 300 miles distant had risen in open rebellion, attacking Blood-Crowned forces and declaring independence from his imposed authority. Draven's army began hemorrhaging soldiers as men deserted to protect homes suddenly threatened, as mercenaries recognized that their employer's grip was not as secure as advertised. The siege that had seemed unbreakable began to fracture like ice under spring sun. But Draven was not finished. Even as his forces weakened, even as reports of disaster flooded in from territories he had thought secured, he prepared a final gambit. Execution of Cassia Winterborn, public and theatrical, designed to demonstrate that resistance would be punished absolutely. Marcus watched from the battlements as a platform was erected within view of Ironhold's walls. Watched as Cassia was dragged forth in chains, her defiance visible even at distance. Watched as Draven stood beside her with hand resting on device that must be the dead man trigger, ready to slaughter thousands if anyone interfered with his revenge. "We have to save her." Lyanna's voice broke with anguish she could no longer contain. "Papa, we cannot let that monster kill her. If we attack, he triggers the explosives, and thousands die." Marcus felt his own helplessness like physical weight crushing his chest until breathing became labor. We are trapped watching while he demonstrates the cost of opposing him. But then movement on the platform caught his attention. Cassia had managed to free one hand from her restraints, was reaching toward Draven with speed that suggested opportunity recognized and seized. She struck him, not with killing force, but with precise blow that made his hand spasm away from the trigger device. Then she shouted words that carried across the distance. "Now, Marcus, trust me, now!" Marcus did not hesitate, did not calculate, trusted the woman who had proven herself worthy of that trust over and over. He gave the signal and his forces attacked with everything remaining, exhausted soldiers finding final reserves of strength because the moment demanded it. The assault unfolded in 3 coordinated phases that Marcus had drilled into his commanders during desperate pre-dawn hours. Phase 1 struck with thunderous impact. Commander Kale's cavalry, 300 mounted knights in wedge formation, hit Bloodcrown's left flank where intelligence suggested mercenary companies held position. Lances lowered, the charge broke through defensive lines like a hammer through glass. Horses screamed and men died, and the mercenaries, fighters who valued coin over conviction, broke ranks after 15 minutes of brutal close combat. Exactly as Cassia had predicted. Phase 2 belonged to Marcus personally. His wolf form, 8 feet of silver-furred fury, an enhanced bone structure capable of withstanding pike thrusts that would have killed human soldiers, crashed through enemy formations with devastating effect. Behind him, 200 heavy infantry advanced in shield wall formation, each step purchased with blood, but each yard gained bringing them closer to the execution platform where Cassia faced death. The Ironwood regulars in the center were different breed entirely. True believers in Draven's vision of order through domination, they died hard, giving ground only when no choice remained. Marcus felt blades score his flanks, felt pike points glance off bones reinforced by transformation that made him something more and less than human, felt the hot arterial spray as claws opened throats and jaws found purchase in exposed necks. This was not clean combat of training yards, but ugly reality of close-quarters killing. Men screaming as intestines spilled from opened bellies, bowels voiding in death's final indignity, the copper taste of blood mixing with chemical stink of fear sweat into sensory overload that broke lesser warriors who had not learned to push past horror. But Marcus had survived Crimson Keep, had learned that pushing past the nightmare, past the exhaustion, past the voice screaming to stop, was how survivors endured when quitting meant death. 70 yards to platform, then 50, then 30. Phase 3 provided covering fire from elevated positions. Archer companies whose volleys were timed to create corridors of relative safety that closed behind advancing troops like doors slamming shut. Each wave calculated to the second, transforming chaos into coordinated assault that gave individual soldiers maximum chance of survival while maintaining relentless forward pressure. What followed was chaos and carnage and the grinding reality of close combat, where death came from every angle and survival was measured in heartbeats between one blade's miss and another's strike. Marcus fought his way toward the platform, his sword singing through enemy ranks with precision born from decades of experience purchased with scars and pain and losses that never stopped haunting. Around him, his soldiers fell and died and kept pushing forward because their general led from the front and gave them example to follow when courage faltered. Draven turned to face him as Marcus reached the platform, and Marcus saw in the other man's eyes the recognition that this was ending. that the carefully constructed empire built on murder and manipulation was collapsing under weight of its own corruption, that sometimes, against all odds, the righteous did triumph over the expedient. Their duel was brief and brutal. Draven fought with skill that matched Marcus's own, each man pushing the other to edges of capability that separated masters from mere competence. Steel rang against steel in patterns that told stories of training and experience and choices made over years that had led to this moment. But Marcus fought with purpose beyond simple survival, fought for Cassia and Felix and Lyanna and every person who had suffered under Draven's regime. Fought for the principle that mercy could be strength and that justice mattered more than power. The killing blow came not from Marcus's blade, but from arrow that struck Draven's throat, fired by archer whose position Marcus could not identify in the chaos. Draven fell, blood spreading across expensive armor in patterns that suggested arterial damage incompatible with continued life. His eyes were wide with shock that death had found him after all. And with his death, the battle ended. Blood-crowned forces surrendered or fled. The siege broke like fever, finally cooling. And Marcus found himself holding Cassia as she collapsed into his arms, her strength finally exhausted. "You came." Her voice emerged barely above whisper through lips cracked and bleeding. "You trusted me even when it seemed insane. Always." Marcus surprised himself with the truth of that single word. "From the moment you pushed your son toward me in that storm, I knew you were worth trusting." The aftermath was complex and difficult in ways that simple combat never achieved. Felix had indeed been safe, hidden with resistance agents who had infiltrated Draven's camp. The Continental Alliance, presented with overwhelming evidence of corruption and assassination, moved to dismantle the network of complicit officials who had enabled Bloodcrown's rise. Territories were returned to displaced populations. Reforms were instituted to prevent future such conspiracies. But the cost had been severe. 300 soldiers dead in final battle. Hundreds more died during siege from starvation and disease. Families destroyed, children orphaned. The arithmetic of war written in blood and grief that no victory could erase or justify, only honor through remembrance. Marcus supervised the building of memorial gardens, where names of the fallen were carved in stone that would outlast the memories of those who walked past centuries hence. He walked among the graves with Lyanna at his side, teaching her that victory and righteousness did not erase the price paid by those who had bled for both. Cassia recovered slowly, her body's resilience again proving remarkable, though the healing was measured in weeks rather than days. She worked with Continental Alliance investigators, providing testimony and evidence that reshaped political landscape throughout the Northern Territories. Her father's intelligence network was legitimized, transformed from shadow operation to official institution, tasked with preventing future corruption. And gradually, carefully, she and Marcus began to explore the connection that siege and shared purpose had forged between them. Not dramatic romance, but quiet partnership built on respect and trust and understanding of what each had sacrificed to reach this moment. 6 months after the siege ended, they married in small ceremony attended by close friends and family, whose presence mattered more than the crowds of nobles who had fled when times grew difficult. Lyanna served as witness, her joy palpable as she gained not just stepmother, but a friend who had proven herself worthy of the title. Felix, now 10 months old and thriving, became Marcus's adopted son with all legal rights and protections that position entailed. The combined territories of Frostmark and restored Silvercrest prospered under their joint leadership. Marcus's tactical brilliance balanced by Cassia's intelligence networks and political acumen. Two people who had been forged by trauma into weapons, slowly learning to become human again in each other's presence. But the scars remained. Marcus still woke sometimes from nightmares of Crimson Keep, of choosing mercy that got people killed. Still carried guilt for those who had died because he chose principle over pragmatism. Cassia startled at loud noises, flinched from unexpected touch, bore wounds that would never fully heal. They did not pretend otherwise, did not claim that love conquered all or that happy endings erased difficult middles. They simply moved forward together, supporting each other through the darkness, finding light where it existed and creating it where it did not. Lyanna grew into a young woman of remarkable strength and compassion, trained as diplomat rather than warrior, carrying forward her mother's legacy of seeking third options when others saw only binary choices. Felix learned the stories of both his fathers, the one who had loved his mother and died protecting her, the one who had chosen to become father to a child not his blood because love transcended biology. And Marcus Ironfang, the Wolf of Frostmark, who had learned at terrible cost that mercy could be both weakness and strength depending on how it was applied, found something he had thought forever lost at Crimson Keep. Not innocence, which could never be recovered once experience had stripped it away, but hope. Hope that the world, despite its cruelty and injustice, still contained space for people who chose compassion over convenience. Hope that standing for principle, even when the cost seemed unbearable, might inspire others to similar courage. Hope that the next generation, represented by Lyanna and Felix and children throughout territories now freed from Draven's corruption, might build something better than what their parents had inherited. On quiet evenings, Marcus would stand on the battlements where he had once watched enemy forces gather for siege, would look out over lands that had been purchased with blood and defended with principles he had nearly abandoned. Cassia would join him there, her hand finding his, her presence a reminder of the storm that had changed everything. "Her pup is freezing, Daddy," Lyanna's voice echoing across the years, innocent and devastating in its simple compassion. And Marcus had chosen, in that moment, to value mercy over pragmatism, to risk everything on the possibility that righteousness mattered, to remember that beneath the Iron General, beneath the scars and hardness that command required, lived a man capable of choosing right over easy. That choice had nearly destroyed him, had cost hundreds of lives and brought suffering to thousands more, but it had also prevented greater evil, had stopped corruption that would have consumed entire territories, had given hope to people who had thought themselves powerless against systematic oppression. The mathematics were impossible to calculate with certainty. Did the good outweigh the harm? Did saving future thousands justify losing present hundreds? These were questions without clear answers, kept Marcus awake in dark hours when doubt whispered its familiar arguments. But then Cassia would shift beside him in their bed, would reach for him in sleep with trust that still amazed him. Or Lyanna would laugh at something Felix did, the sound like bells celebrating simple joy. Or he would walk through markets where people traded freely, lived without fear of corrupt officials and arbitrary violence. And Marcus would think that perhaps, despite everything, despite all the costs and complications and impossible choices, they had managed something worth the price. Not victory in any simple sense, not happy ending that erased suffering, but survival, continuation, the possibility of better futures built on foundations that honored both strength and mercy, both justice and compassion. And the winter had been long and harsh. The storm that brought Cassia to his gates had tested everything he believed about himself and the world. But they had endured, and in that endurance, Marcus found the only certainty that mattered. That some things were worth fighting for even when victory seemed impossible. That some people deserved protection even when pragmatism suggested abandonment. That mercy, applied with wisdom rather than weakness, could indeed be strength. The Wolf of Frostmark had learned to temper iron with compassion, had discovered that the hardest battles were fought not against external enemies, but against the internal voices that urged cruelty in the name of pragmatism. And though scars remained, though nightmares persisted, though doubt never entirely quieted, Marcus Ironfang had found something he had not known he was seeking when he rode into that killing storm. Redemption, perhaps, or simply the peace that came from knowing he had chosen to be the man his daughter believed him to be, rather than the weapon circumstances had tried to forge. The stars wheeled overhead, the seasons turned, and in Ironhold Citadel, rebuilt and strengthened, a family that had been forged in fire learned to live in the light. Not perfect, not without struggle, but together, and that was enough.